Welcome to Varn Vlog Solo Live, and I don't do these very often. Don't get used to them. They're not going to start anytime soon being a regular thing for non-patrons. There's a lot to talk about. I just got back from the Society of U.S. Intellectual History conference in Denver, where I presented what is about half of a chapter of my Christopher Lasch book. And that went over fairly well. The specific chapter has been made. A typo still included, unfortunately, because I hadn't even finished fully proofing it. Available to patrons. Revisions to it will be made available to patrons as well. And eventually, when Shalyn and I finish the book, which might be years, I'm going to be honest, Shalyn is finishing her dissertation on the history of pop culture in the 1980s and 90s, which should also be a very interesting book when it's done and released. And I'm also finally working on a book of essays because I'm tired of you guys asking me to write stuff down on my thinking on politics and history. It's probably going to go to Revo Books, which is a small press run by Deb Mello and I believe Mike Watkins. But nonetheless, we'll see where that book of essays goes. That's not why I'm here today. I'm not here to pimp books that'll probably not come out for a couple years. Although if you're interested in books, there's 2 poetry books that are still available. I need to talk about the channel here, and I'm going to also use this to pivot to talk about broader trends and, quote, left-wing media, because in many ways, I am deliberately going against the trends in left-wing media. And there's some things that I have to kind of announce, some of which have obvious, some of which don't. You will, if you look at the scheduled program, you will see that we have a bunch of stuff in eco-socialism coming up. We have a bunch of brief essays. Next week, I take Robert Urey's essay on fascism and the continuity it has with liberal thought and non-liberal thought. I actually think Urey misses a few things. There's also going to be essays by Kohei Sato that I'm going to cover. And believe it or not, Adrian Rich, the poet, writing on Raya Donetskaya. You will notice basically you're going to get the following format from here on out: 1 interview a week, sometimes 2. I don't do more than 5 a month now. I'm going to get into why in a minute. There's going to be a bigger diversity of topics. I'm doing a lot more work in intellectual history and a lot less stuff on the popular, left-wing media circuit. I hate the left-wing media circuit. I'm not going to lie. I don't like BreadTube. I don't like its new faux neo-Stalinist edgelord replacement. I don't like I don't like the Greater Jacobin, the Dig media system. Although, I don't dislike the Dig. I like Dan Denver enough. I have scholarly friends and people that I've seen, particularly when I go to conferences and in stuff I deal in literature, which is actually my field, that I think people need to see. And I know between that and me leaving Twitter, that's going to mean that my audience doesn't have as much reach as it could. It is hard looking at some BreadTube channels where like people are either doing the most milquetoast politics or the most impossible politics. Like there's no political basis for this stuff, and yet they're getting 70, 80,000 views. I know that the dynamics for that for here are different because I don't monetize the channel. Right. Part of that is because the non patron feed stuff and the non free podcast stuff is educational, and I don't want to make money from it. I don't want to make money from doing reporting on Palestine, for example, because I'm not a journalist. I have no risk in doing it, and I can actually hurt things by saying something stupid. Although I mean, it's hard to know how much of effect it would actually have. But beyond making statements about moral positions that you have to do, I just find that if I was to turn my stream into Palestine right now, I'd have triple the viewers. I know I would. I've seen other channels do it. But are they affecting change? I was in a plenary on Mike Davis on Friday at this conference in Denver. And we were talking about the work of Mike Davis pretty systemically. Nelson Lichtenstein was talking about his early work, and Andrew Hartman, who's been on the show, was talking about Oh God's New Enigmas. And a scholar asked, what does it mean to be doing a conference like this and talking about Mike Davis when there's 250 kids dying in Palestine a day right now? And I thought about it. And my response was one of the respondents, who actually is from the Middle East. I don't remember their name off the top of my head. I guess I could look it up. No, I will not have Norman Finkelstein on my show. So what I listened to that day, and I'll get back to the rest of this, was what can intellectual historians do about Palestine? And the answer is, depending on their skill set, nothing that anyone else can't do, which is very little. And I'm not here to blackpill all of you. I'm not here to depress you. In fact, I want to start talking about ways to get out of that, to start looking at this broader system. What I want people to start looking at is what are the larger intellectual milieus? What are the things that led you here? All right. Why do things feel like the way they do? How is what's happening right now in the Biden administration related to Henry Wallace and the Popular Front going down in flames, and people like Arthur Schlesinger and Reinhold Niebuhr, to just take two examples of my friend Tristan Van Tine's own work, his work. Why did they believe they were going to get a lot more out of Keynesian quasi-social democracy than they did, and how has that led to here? And why is it now that people who claim to be Marxist are celebrating the same thing that people who were explicitly anti-Marxist were talking about back then? I want you to look at that honestly, because if you ever want your politics to start mattering, and for those of us who are in our 30s and 40s, for millennials, we still have a political future ahead of us, but most of it's going to be teaching and doing some leadership. It's not going to be this grand revolutionary thing. We're not the right group of people to do that anymore. If we were ever, we failed. Now, dwelling in that failure over and over again and just reliving it. It's just a way to traumatize yourself into being a reactionary, right? You see this happen with all the shows that do like, well, the left problem is this, and they take these horrible takes and they double down, and they get more and more popular by being, you know, bitter, resentful, um, uh, embittered people who also can't do anything. Um, and that's not useful, right? Political organizing actually requires you not to have dreams that are based off of false hopes. And people are naming out specific people, but this is across the board, like right now, um in a way that makes me feel very alienated, because I've been talking about this literally for guys. I started doing left wing podcast in 2011. All right, we are now almost 13 years into me doing this project in some ways. Now, Varn Blog's only 3 years old. I've done Pop the Left 3 different times. I guess theoretically there's a Pop the Left on Zero. Well, excuse me, Sublation books now. It's highly irregular. Don't expect it to be regular, because Doug Lane, and I'm not part of Sublation's media team at all. He has to contract me out separately, and at this point in my life, that does require a contract. Furthermore, I've devoted literally now almost 20 years of my life to understanding Marx and Marxism as my primary intellectual pursuit outside of poetry and teaching. And I have, to be frank, long since hit a wall where I think all of that thought is going to be that illuminating. I can see where the cul-de-sacs are. I can point out to you where there are contradictions between people. I can point out to you how hard it is to reconcile what X thinker did politically with what they said. And I'm going to continue doing that. But there's a reality of the situation where I've been covering the same material for so long that I get mad at my audience, because they ask me questions that I forget that, like, you guys may have only known about me for 1 or 2 years, where like I've been repeating myself for 20. So there's going to be more opportunities for new stuff to come up. People mentioned the literature stuff. There will be more streams on literature. I want to do more on the history and context for current geopolitics. And the theory that might come out of that, as you saw in the beginning, I'm now advertising this as a place where different disciplines can come in so they can be put in contact with each other, so we can do something with it politically. What does it mean if we know these things? All right. But what I don't want you to do is to think that I can give you a bunch of answers to your political problems, because some of them I don't think any one person can answer. And if anyone did answer it by themselves, they would be misleading you. And I know people get mad at that. And I don't mean this in a cynical way. There are certain people in the left media who will say that they're not really doing anything but entertainment and back away. I'm not that entertaining, let's be honest. Right? Like I mean, I'm kind of funny sometimes, and I get mad at people. um so what I'm saying is, there's no chance that this podcast is going away. I frankly, I can afford to live in Salt Lake as a high school teacher, because you guys give me enough that I can pay my rent and still eat. But and buy books, so I'm not going away. but this is broadening in its vision, and I am aware that that might lose me viewers or listeners. And there's another paradox I want to talk to you pretty honestly about before we get into the Q&A section and some other key announcements. So just to recap for those who come, there's going to be one interview a week. There's going to be the Radical Engagement series. Sometimes I will do a pre-recorded solo. You'll probably get a couple of those a month. This is all for free. But I want to broaden out who I interview to conclude more historians and philosophers than just the people in the Marxist fucking internet circuit. That's a death spiral in a lot of ways. And people, if they do too much of it, they start like wanting to walk away and just do pop culture shit or whatever. And it doesn't help you. Or they get stuck into thinking the discourse on Twitter, or X as it's now called, is actually a substantive political discourse. What I find really problematic is there's two moves that people can make right now that's fundamentally dishonest. They can do the the internet's not real life. Unfortunately, for a whole lot of people under the age of 40, it is real life. But that doesn't lead to real political movement, because a lot of what's being discussed as politics is, frankly, it's not impossible, but they're so far removed from the steps that you'd have to do to even begin to talk about these things that it's effectively a form of wish projection entertainment. Now, I want to give you guys a broader history of the way that the Euro-American Canadian left. So we'll just say the English-speaking world and its Western European adjacent forebearers got here, and trying to understand the historical situation of places that are outside of that sphere. I'm going to be honest with you, that's never popular. All right. Everyone says do more foreign policy stuff or do more deep dives into the history of a country. Whenever I do those get the least views of anything I do. That and literature are the two things that get the least views. I don't give a fuck anymore. All right. I have a Patreon of a little under 400 backers, which puts me in the mid tier of patrons. Patron podcast. If you want to know what I make per year off that, it's less than 19K. I can't even support myself on it, much less hire a crew to like clean everything up. But I'm not worried about it because my day job is as a teacher. That's what I do, and I think people forget that. So we have to start thinking about how to interface and bring this depth and kind of cut against the trends in media consumption, because a lot of the trends right now are counterproductive. I don't think all parasociality is counterproductive. In fact, people have misread me as saying that in the past. I don't think, first of all, like when I talk about multipolarity, parasociality is like rain. People do it. All right. And they don't just do it to like in this intense way like you do over Twitter, where you get some interaction with a person, and thus it's not totally parasocial. Because parasocial is a one-way social relationship. Social relationships in the social media space or in something like this are like not entirely one way. Like I do have vague idea about like 1/100th of my audience is as people. The difference is that you know a lot more about me than I do about any of you. And that produces a perverse incentives to make everything about myself and to turn my own life into a show. And I think that's psychologically, ethically, politically destructive. People do it all the time. People have gotten rich off of doing this. But, it is what it is. Secondly, um, but bad incentives around that, however, is that it leads people more tied into drama around like a projected internet culture that is in some ways to borrow something from Jason Miles of This Is Revolution, really is kind of a kayfabe. Um, but is not doesn't lead you to any new political politics, and it burns all sides out. It hollows people out, right? Because it gives you the feeling that your attachments to media figures or something is doing something. I made this point over and over and over again. So that's a problem. There's also the way in which, like, the best way to get attention in the way the algorithmic model works, particularly on places like Twitter, our X, is to be frankly wrong, inflammatorily wrong, and in such a way that gets you shared and makes you the quote main character of the internet for a day and gets you a ton of eyes and gets people to double down on defending you. But it does nothing to encourage you to be intellectually interesting, creative, or to adjust your thought in real time to real changing and shifting events, and to take ownership of where you've been mistaken before. And that is true for both the media creators, but also the audience. So it's hard to say. Yes, there are people who do good stuff for this. I gave Hassan Piker for doing credit for actually raising money for Palestinian aid, and I'm sure he was totally legit. Got it to the right organizations, but it is a place under siege. It's hard to know what that aid's going to do right now. Which isn't to say don't give it. I mean, this is why this is so hard. But there's a lot of realities coming up about U.S. politics that I feel like I've been watching two tracks simultaneously. People who are doing the same things that we've done now in a 4-generation cycle or a 5-generation cycle. One of the ironies about what I've researched is I used to think the new left was the problem, and everybody talks about that. Everybody from Catherine Liu to whoever talks about that, right? The more I've studied these primary source documents for this Christopher Lasch book, the more I see that no, this goes back to things that happened in the 1920s. So much geopolitics goes back to things that happened in the 1920s. And whenever you're doing punditry that's historically literate and quote historically materialist, whatever the fuck that means to you, you have to have a cutoff point. But I can tell you that most people's cutoff point isn't even 6 years, and I'm increasingly like it needs to be at least 100. And that can be overwhelming, and that's why it's hard for a show like mine to have a huge audience, because I'm like, okay, I might be doing interviews with people on ideas about how the right came out of specifically Mormon theology in the colonization of the West. Like, that's something Americans should know about. That's something the world who wants to understand the American mindset and its religious landscape should know about, right? But that's a niche interest. It's something we have to overcome and kind of train ourselves from, because what I'm seeing, what my generation of thinkers can do now is to teach people who have more energy and time to organize. In the grand scheme of things, I'm still pretty young, but for people involved in radical politics, I'm ancient. Let's be honest. All right. We can be mad at boomers all we want, but a lot of these problems go back to the Popular Front. And I actually did a solo video where I talked about the problems of some of the stuff that limited the Popular Front in the United States went back to the 1890s. right? With the populists making detente with the Democrats when they were still the Dixiecrats and the proto Dixiecrats and the Bourbon Democrats, the super conservative Confederate Democrats back in the day. But then we also have to go further than that. What about all the former socialists and 48ers who entered the Republican Party? You know, people at Cosmonaut Magazine make a big deal out of that. Well, what's the history of that? And was it successful? And why? Right? Most of the history of philosophy, theory, and politics is pathological. By that, I mean you're looking at why it failed or how it lied to itself. But you shouldn't be doing that just to make yourself feel better. The question that you should have is, where have I been wrong? What have I done to contribute to this? And also, that can be totally ego boosting too. You'd be like, oh, I totally fucked up the left. No, you didn't. No, you didn't. You exist in the same context. Neither me nor you are that important, right? But you do need to think about it so that what contributions you do make are both good for any political movement, but also good for you, right? This is under discussed. A lot of the habits that these kinds of things inculcate in people are bad for you as an individual. And if it's bad for you as an individual, it's often bad for the collective too, if that's the way you think. Why are we relegating radical politics to the young? We are not. However, there's a reality of who has time and who has the ability to organize. Like, yes, I want less student revolt stuff. You're right. But it's also true that like every organization that I've looked at going all the way back for 200 years has been mostly made out of 20-year-olds. It's been made out of D-Class A people. It's been made out of people who were marginalized, not just exploited. It's been made out of fail sons and fail daughters. You know, this is this is uh this is something that we need to just kind of deal with. Um, the other thing I think that people need to quit doing is to quit projecting what they think the working class is. It's not one thing. It's just not. The tendencies within broad classes like that are hard to deal with. It's just the way it is. There's a reason, however, as I mentioned when mentioning Arthur Schlesinger and Reinhold Niebuhr, that the kind of Cold War ex-Marxist liberalism that led to both neoconservatism and the New Democrats in the 1970s. There's a reason why that's leading people to turn away from liberalism as a whole. And that itself is turning Marxists into people who are just totally reacting against liberalism, even though they can't even define what they mean by it. So liberalism is whatever the thing of the moment they dislike is. Or it is leading people, a smaller number of people into trying to promote bourgeois values as the primary form of revolutionary values, and that's it. And the people who do the latter could look radically politically opposed to each other. Like Platypus Filiated Society and Ben Burgess do not get along, but they kind of have a similar project on that front. All right, that's for me at this point in time, even beyond quote Marxism or whatever. Like I'm going to say I'm not interested in saving Marxism as some kind of grand historical project. I'm interested in socialism. My understanding of socialism comes from a Marxist tradition, but I've read enough of it now to know that if I'm honest about what it says, it's not always in agreement with itself. And that's not because of Engels corrupting it or anything like that, like the New Left said occasionally. It's literally because Marx is inconsistent in his notes and in his thinking. And that's because he was honest. And that's why he published a little bit of it in his lifetime. And Marxisms are way beyond Marx. I mean, everyone uses Marx as a ventriloquist dummy, like the fucking Bible. I mean, it is what it is. There's so many places where people do with Marxism or the working class or whatever what Protestant Christians do with God. It's whatever you want it to be. Right? That's not like, this is why I'm always talking about, like, your definitions matter, your clarifications matter, what you're talking about. Be specific. Don't talk about the left. The left is a moving signifier. It's not totally floating, but it's close. Anyway, so this change in orientation just means I need to broaden out the kinds of interviews I do. And that's maybe going to change the audience. The next thing I want to talk about is the actual shows available. I love how people talk to me when they talk to me directly as if and address me as if I have any idea who they are. It's one of the things that confuses the shit out of me here. It's kind of amusing trend. Removal of distance that the internet allows people to falsely have. Like, you can address people as if we were casual friends and then argue amongst themselves. It's a very strange thing. Anyway, back to the point. I've had to sit down with a couple of my collaborators uh, who I've worked with for a long time. And it's not necessarily been a fun time to do that, to be frank. Some people don't want to work with me anymore. That's not the case with the important people, and vice versa. There's a lot of people who they have needed to take away to get things together. Abby Hassan of the Vulgar Complexity series, we have ended the series indefinitely. Because of my contentious relationship with prior collaborators, people think that it's personal, but actually Abby just got a good job. And he's got a family, so he's got to go do that. Jordan is having to, for personal reasons that I'm not going to go into in a live stream, and actually don't ask me either, because it is personal. Jordan's going to be taking a hiatus for a few months herself, and so the how do I say this? The excavations and some of the nailing it down. I might restart the Critique of the Goethe series with a few different collaborators to come on it. But for now, the excavations series is going to be going on sabbatical for a while. For those of you who hadn't realized, I need to go through all the shows that come on, both behind the Patreon and not, and make this announcement. The Sato will get finished eventually, so don't worry. And I'm gonna pick up different parts of Sato to cover it in other places. Okay. The So let's go through the series. Nothing's changing with diving into the wreckage with me and Sean K of Antifada. In fact, if anything, you're gonna get more of that. We're doing it like every 3 weeks right now because it's just so hard. We're trying to, like, we keep on thinking, oh, we're gonna be able to stop on this project, and then something happens, and we're like, oh no. So there is a series coming out. I don't believe it's been released for Antifada people yet, on nationalism. I no longer have affiliations with Class Unity group or any of that. It's not that I have any hostility towards them. So if you are expecting more collaborations there, it might happen informally, but it's not happening formally. I have increased working with Strange Matters magazine, although they are slowing down their production because they're releasing issue 3. So if you're wondering, like, why is the Strange Matters collaboration so irregular, that's because they're doing editing. So that is still happening, but it's gonna be probably every 6 weeks. People have asked me about Pop the Left. I have no idea. Doug and I's politics, the longer that we haven't worked directly together, the further apart we seem. But when we talk, it seems to go fine. So who knows? The question is, like I said, I'm subcontract to Civilization. I'm not on the team. I don't want to be on the team. It's not because I have any ill will towards them, but I like working on my own. Elijah Emery will be coming back. We don't so much do live streams because Elijah is a graduate student at an undisclosed location. So I have to kind of schedule our stuff around that. Nico Villarreal, who I think is the most, the guest who comes on the most, and then Jules Asele. They will both be coming on in the future. Jules is increasingly talking about religious left stuff and theology, and Nico is continuing to do his stuff on structural political economy, and they will be regular guests. Let's see what other shows. Gaming Materialist is over. Gene Bajelon has left the building. Gene is still my friend. But if you don't know, and maybe I should be careful, I don't know how much is announced, he has left podcasting altogether. Maybe not forever, but last time I talked to him, he doesn't know when he will want to do it again. He still has a radio show on Pure History if you're in the Indiana area, but he's done. He's out. So Gaming Materialist has been retired. The archives will be kept maintained by me on the Patreon if you want them, and all the free shows will be here. But Gene is done. So yeah. Missouri, not Indiana. Missouri. Yeah, I always like him. Blanket that together. What else? There's a lot. See, Parallax Vlog is still happening, but JG has a very irregular schedule, so that's probably been moved to every 6 to 8 weeks. That's a Patreon-only show anyway. It doesn't affect the YouTube channel. What other shows do I have to... Excavations is on indefinite hiatus because I only do that with Jordan. As soon as Jordan comes back next year... And Jordan's here and think there's nothing personal. Like Jordan and I didn't have a fight or anything like that. So yeah. And so what's being maintained? Every last Thursday of the month, there will be a co-stream GTA Varn blog where I come on and represent, the opposite kind of realist from Deep State Kuba, who's a different kind of realist than me. Subset of theoretical practice, whenever they want to come on the show, any of them, I would love for them to come on. They're always welcome. It's hard to schedule because they're in Brazil and I'm here. And it's I think it's like a 5-hour difference. But so it's one of those things. It's not like with Britain or with Australia where I can kind of like play with staying up really late or getting up really early. Ideal times for them tends to be when I'm at work. But yes, there's no that hasn't ended. We've never done a full formal collab. I just really like those guys. So that's still going on. What other shows do I do? This tells you how crazy it is. Radical Engagements has changed. I think I announced it last week. I'm only doing essays for the free show. I couldn't finish books. I can't legally read an entire book on the fucking channel and give you commentary on all of it. And I also sometimes needed to do, I do a ton of research for the shows, but there's still stuff I miss. Like there's Baudrillard books where I like found the publication date, but I got when a specific essay in it was published wrong, and it's just a problem. So I'm limiting myself to essays that are either freely available online or are from books, but they're short enough that I'm perfectly, since this is a non-monetized YouTube channel, perfectly okay reading the whole thing and being within the letter of the law. So that's what Radical Engagement is going to be for the public. Is there any other shows? There is a new show coming up. Negation Magazine people. I just haven't talked to them forever, and I only knew them on Twitter, and I'm not on Twitter anymore. I'm going to talk about that in a little while too. So you'll see Radical Engagements. One of the things that's changing about Radical Engagements is that I am occasionally, if you're a patron, taking, like, if you want to suggest I cover an article, or even if, frankly, guys, if you guys have an article that's in the public, just like, freely available online, and I don't have something coming out from the Patreon, you guys can just ask in the show notes. I mean, like in the show comments for me to cover something. That's fine. So am I done with TIR? No, there's no bad blood between Jason and I, and there's no bad blood between Pascal and I. In fact, I talked to Pascal on the phone recently. But White Guy Wednesday is over, I think. There's no Gene, and I don't have time to commit to it. Plus, there's still the GTA with Kuba and I. So you will see me on TIR randomly, but it's not going to be scheduled. It's not regular like that. I've never been part of the crew. I am like the expanded universe crew anyway. So it is what it is. Let's see what else. So I've covered Jules, Nico, and Elijah are still going to be regular guests. I've covered that we're expanding the scope. Oh, I am more affiliated with Member School. I am a scholar there. I don't know what that means. Occasionally, I will do reading groups with them. So if you're into that, I'm over there in those spaces. But that's really it. No Royal Road's coming back. It's staying back. And I do have one announcement of a new show. Sean, at least sometimes, of Antifada, Jason of No Royal Road, and myself are starting, we haven't named it yet, a reading series on reading right-wing literature. So, like, we're going to go through and do a chapter by chapter on, like, the Dugin book. I think Dugin's overrated overstated his political influence, but I think like given that people are even trying to argue that we have to understand right-wing anti-imperialism, etc., um, that I'm going to go in and do readings of right-wing literature. Not, not to be sympathetic. It's just someone's got to get out. Like, you know, I said, get out. It's important that someone engages with this work. Yeah. Ender, did you do an episode with Sean Guillory? Yes, but it's lost in the Zero Books controversy. So. So that'll be me. So now we're going to the Q&A session since I made all the announcements. I'm going to explain my thinking and what kind of scholars we're going to do. And I warned you that there's going to be random topics coming on. So it's something that I think we need to sit down and really parse. I'm not going to just be doing stuff like Dugin. I'm going to be doing libertarians. We're going to be doing right-wing literature of all different kinds of right wings. Right. Well, okay. Jason Miles and I still talk on a regular basis, so he will still be on the show. Like, I don't want people thinking there's bad blood with me and anybody who stops shows. Gene and I talk almost every day. All right. There's no questions in Discord. We're just going to do questions in here today because this is a public live stream. I'll do some more mainstream thinkers like, yeah, I want to talk about them, Mises, Hayek, people that are more influential, like neoconservative thinkers, even like Fromm, Posner, and I might even expand it to people who I see as kind of right-wing liberals like Isaiah Berlin or John Gray. We are starting off with Dugin because Dugin's what everyone's talking about right now, and I've read so much of that shit from even that I want to kind of get in on understanding why people find this attractive as a left-winger, because I've never understood that. In fact, I've always kind of read Dugin as like coffee shop post-Stalinism, but it is what it is. All right. Yeah, I agree. There's unfortunately what a lot the right-wing thinking that a lot of leftists find attractive is stuff that's just as marginal as leftist stuff. And so while I want to go into that, I want to actually understand. I think we're going to talk about what we're covering, doing stuff to understand what makes conservatism and reactionaryism different. But we need to read both. I also there's a lot of times where when I cover that kind of stuff, I get a lot of comments from clearly right wingers who get mad that I talk too much about how this guy is or is not a leftist or whatever. And it's funny because it's always the leftists getting mad at me for like giving someone like Spengler too much credit, and then the right wingers show up and like, well, why were you concerned about this in the first place? And I was like, okay. So I mean that's annoying, but it's not a reason not to cover the material. Would you consider John Stuart Mill a right-wing author? No, he's a liberal author. Although, you know what? There are times where I wonder if I need to do a reading series on liberalism. The issue that I have with liberalism is that I rarely find liberal thinkers insightful the way I can find conservative and reactionary thinkers who are often insightful but definitely wrong about how to fix it, but they're often like really honest about what the problems are. Um, but of course, like you know, good faith or bad faith, whatever. It is what it is. So that's why I'm doing it. I actually miss that. I missed educating people about that world. You know, the most popular videos I've done on this channel is first Christmas, then the Palestine video is super popular, which I don't know how to feel about. Although I guess it's for people who thought that maybe I was secretly a Zionist or something, it really cleared that up. And the third one, the the third ones are all the ones I do in Matt McManus on the history of conservative thought. You know, like know your enemy style stuff. Um, so there you go. And then all the stuff I do at member school, and so I'm involved with member school. So questions, they're scrolling so fast I'm missing them. So let's actually get to these questions. The Gene Leave TR chat. Yes, Gene has left all podcasting. He might come back to TR, but he's there's no more White Guy Wednesday. That's all over. Okay. Varn, you mentioned before that you have less faith in economics as a useful tool. Do you have plans to also cover economic topics less? No, I don't. I hope not personally. And no, I don't. I just plan to cover them critically. The more I learn about all these even heterodox models of econ, the less I trust how they're using stats. It's not that stats aren't useful. People have misunderstood me when I talk to like Jules Delille about this. It's not that we don't find stats somewhat useful. It's that you have to disaggregate what the stats actually are. And often when you do that, you realize like we're talking about like apples and kumquats or apples and titanium. It's not even the same stuff that's being squeezed together. And so a lot of econometrics is hard. But then if you go to other kinds of economics, such as historical materialism or praxeology, or even certain kinds of MMT, everything like the paradigms are so priorly assumed that like you can't even mention them without accepting some of the paradigms in ways that are hurtful. All right. Eric Rapp asks, I actually have I don't know how to say your name. Sarek. I see you all the time. I have no idea how to say that name. A dive into the history of political Catholicism will be interesting. I'm actually going to go into politicized left-wing Catholicism in the future, but I'm also probably going to have to do right-wing political Catholicism eventually. Okay, Eric Rapp asks, earlier you mentioned people pushing bourgeois values as radical. Who is that a reference to? Okay, there's one camp that's like the Mike McManus, Ben Burgess camp. Matt McManus, not Mike McManus, sorry. Who like socialism as the fulfillment of communism because of liberal values. And there's sort of the platypus camp, which is socialism is the fulfillment of bourgeois revolutionary values. And there's only one revolution, that's the revolution, and communism is just fulfillment of that. I don't agree with that, but I mean, it's not a stupid way to, it's not a totally dumb way to handle it. I just don't think that's totally what Marxism ends up being. What's the fundamental goal with the new podcast? So I talked about this in the beginning, but it needs. I think right now that the left wing media space is narrowing in on certain topics. But it is not expanding an understanding of the broad and complex way of history, culture, politics that's contributed to this in a relationally responsible way. And I know that's weird language, and I'll talk about why I'm using it later. So I feel like that needs to be expanded. This has always been a very broad-based podcast. Like it's like it's NPR, but of the left and not mid-tier and boring. But it needs to be even broader. I'm gonna have to interview some right-wing historians on certain things, for example. Not because I want you to become right, and I'd rather interview a right-wing historian than a right-wing pundit. All right. And much less, I'd rather interview a right-wing pundit who's honest about being right-wing than someone who's like, I'm a Marxist, but everything I say agrees with Patrick Deneen. You know, I think we just have to do that responsibly. And I'm good at pushing back on right wingers without alienating them and without doing the whole like, well, let's win the right over by adopting their positions, because we can't. Like, our positions are substantively different, and they kind of have to be. All right. Next question: is there a good book about when the left tide happens and when the inevitable right tide succeeds it? Interestingly, Mao talks about this the most. That there is a dialectically like almost inevitable counter response to left wing last movements, and it seems like Mao, of all the classical, revolutionary leaders, actually had the most to say about this. Do I agree with his answers to it? Not really, but right question. What genre of entertainment, fiction, etc. have you encountered has been worth for? I just watch a lot of horror movies, man. I've been reading a lot of philosophy and a lot of Eastern philosophy lately and Buddhist history, so that's where I've been at. I'm also reading Berserk again, for those of you who want to know. The more should I learn category theory? If you want to understand math, yeah, but I'm not the person to teach it to you. That's Alex. By the way, we run free book groups in the Discord. If you want in the Discord, it's a benefit for being a patron. But if you ask me nicely, I've never turned anyone away unless they were an asshole. All right. Oh, this is bread and butter shit. I'm reading through Joseph Tainter's Class of Complex Society with my group, and it seems like he goes back and forth between using historical materialism and also mischaracterizing Marx. I do not think Tainter. I think Tainter actually ends up being a pretty decent historical materialist, but I think he actually maintains a lot of misunderstandings of Marx that come post Sweezy in the 1960s and 70s. That's why he's misreading Marx. It's because that's the common academic paradigm of that time. One of the things I've learned about trying to understand people misstating what Marx believes is you have to historicize the readings of Marx that were popular as the way that people were reading Marx in that moment and in that culture. And I mean, that's a lot to keep up with, right? It's like, it's not just how are we, what did Marx mean, but how were people interpreting Marx in 1975 so these other thinkers misunderstood it because that was what they heard when they approached the text. It's not to say that like Tainter didn't misread the text. It's just, it's very hard to train yourself not to come in with whatever the current conceptions are of a text when you approach it to read it. In some ways, texts have been pre-read for you by people guiding you on what certain words mean. That's why hermeneutics is really important, and almost no one in left-wing podcasting ever gets down to like explaining what their hermeneutic is for how they read and interpret these texts. They always talk about this in a very naive, like not even high school level. We can just teach people the real Marx without having an interpretive framework that we make clear, and that's a problem. I hope that explains it. It tells you, but yes, I do think Tainter mischaracterizes Marx, and I also think he's a good he becomes a good historical materialist for almost convergent reasons. Like he's not coming at it from that perspective, but and he has a bad tradition that he's reading Marx from, but because he's a really good scientist and a pretty decent historian. I mean, he's an ecologist primarily. He actually does draw pretty decent conclusions. All right. I want to talk more about larger education trends because I am one of the few people on the left who thinks progressive education has largely been a fucking disaster. All right. And that there was the shift in the aughts to make education more about quote social justice made education less substantive even for social justice issues and opened it up for attacks from the right that damages education far beyond what social justice tended to try to reform. but I need like that's going to require me to go into history. There is a very old video somewhere on YouTube. I think it's called Entitled Thoughts by Amog Sahu before we started our own podcast, where there was me for 5 hours going through the history of education in the United States and in places like Mexico to kind of clear up how we got to where we are and what the paradigms are. But the paradigms have shifted since I did that video. I did that video almost a decade ago, but it's available somewhere on YouTube. Deep in the bowels of YouTube is there. Um, all right. Okay, here we go. Another question. How do we overcome the shallow innovations of materialism on the left? I feel like people use it apart from its context in response to German idealism and know little about philosophy of science. Well, one, we have to go, you can't just approach everything with the starting out, the only important stuff you need to know is Kant and Hegel and then Marx's response to it. There's a whole history in historiography, in philosophical development around the debates in a science which Marxists contributed to, even beyond Christopher Caldwell and that sort, and then the New Left sort of soft science rejection that you kind of have to get into. Like, why is the demarcation problem impossible? Because it is. There is no good answer to the demarcation problem that I've ever found. And if you don't know what the demarcation problem is, that's how do we distinguish what is science from what is non-science? And like new atheists and all this shit, they just assume that. What they mostly assumed if they dared to go into that was Karl Popper's falsification theory. But I just want to tell you, a cursory understanding of probabilistic math makes falsification not a good way to frame science. So the problem is most people on the left aren't educated in the histories of the scientist debate and the materialisms debate because they come at it only from the continental and specifically the continental Marxist Hegelian tradition, and that's it. That's all they know. And they may know a little bit of postmodernism if they're a little older and went through that in undergrad or grad school because they majored in philosophy or something. But the vast majority of people don't know that debate. And look, I mean, like one of the things I'm going to tell you, like I throw so much material at you that people get very frustrated because they're like, well, how am I supposed to know all this? And the thing is, you're not. No one can know all this. All right. I do a show where I spend like most of my free time educating myself enough to ask questions about this stuff. That's one of the reasons why I had to go down to 4 interviews a month. I don't really edit the interviews, so it's not that they take me a long time to on the back end. It's like I got to clean up this, I got to remaster the sound, chop off anything where people really screwed up or got cut off or said something super offensive, which I don't normally remove unless they ask me to, and then let it go. That doesn't take that long. What takes a long time with those interviews is I have to read the book and read subsidiary material, and you can kind of tell even when I don't do that because the interviews aren't as good. But on materialism, that like you have to read broadly, and you do have to read in the analytic debates around science to understand the problem. Materialism, means a lot of different things. It's one of these isms like modernism or even Marxism, where the demarcation lines for even what we're talking about varies in different traditions, and most people kind of don't know enough to know that the word doesn't always mean the same thing in every context. I can't recall, Marm. You had a podcast. Were you still doing one on topics of notes? Well, unfortunately, that was Mortal Science. That was a separate podcast from anything on Varn Blog. We finished the essay at hand, and then we stopped. And that's because Esri and I, that is a bad break. We don't talk to each other. Do you have to you have to do that when reading alt text in general? No. Yeah, you always got to recontextualize what the terms mean. I feel like people don't realize when they're basically doing red scientism. Yeah, except that they don't have a good definition of science or positivism. Oh yeah, that's a problem. But without knowing anything about these disciplines and their shortcomings, are their history or like how they got thrown out. Yeah. Uh oh. People asking me about my personal beliefs. All right. What time in history do you find most interesting? Honestly, personally, what I find most interesting is what we cover on what I find most interesting is late antiquity, but not just Rome and Greece. I also find like the Indic civilizations and China really interesting, and the interplay between them in the Islamicate world. And I use Islamicate because if people ask me why I use that word as like if you woke, no, I use Islamicate because not everyone in that world is a Muslim. All right, there are Jews and Christians that are part of the Islamicate world. So I can't say the Islamic world because that would imply that they all belong to Islam. And I don't want to, but I don't want to say that it's like just the medieval Levant because they are ruled by Muslim governments. So if you want to know why I use that term, it's a newish term. It's to point out that the Islamic world was not like born solely of Islam, and also does not just contribute to the quote Islamic worldview. That's why I say Islamicate. It is so. I've never explained why I use certain scholarly technical words before, and people go like, "Why are you doing that?" Well, that's why. Okay. I find that super interesting. I find specific transition periods in history very interesting. The 3rd to the 6th century is super important in like the intellectual history of human thought, and like the way metaphors and stuff emerge out of that shape the way we talk about material world comes really important. And then again, in the beginnings of the quote modern liberal world from the 13th century to the 17th century. And then I find the 20th century really fucking important because we're living through its aftermath right now. So those are the areas I find super helpful. All right. You mentioned somewhere that Buddhism has a useful theory of mind or a moral theory. Can you elaborate? Well, I think Buddhism has a non-essentialist form of virtue ethics at its core, the paramitas and all that, meaning that they actually talk about virtue like ethics. Ethics and virtues are actually part of social relationships, and which ones you value outside of murder and lying. Those are the two absolute no-nos. Change depending on uh, the situation. Whereas when people think I refer to virtue theory, that I'm referring to Catholic or Aristotelian virtue theory, and I am insofar that for most Western readers, that's the only thing they're familiar with. And ancient ways of thinking tend to be virtue theories. It didn't occur to most people prior to the European Enlightenment to try to reduce all of morality down to a singular rule that is a utilitarian or deontological attempt to reduce it down to rules so it can be reduced down to a single reasoning chain that is universal in all categories, right? Like a mathematical equation. Well, I just don't think that fucking works. Like you have moral virtue calculuses where like if you stop certain virtues, you can figure out the results of those virtues, what you've done them, and you can kind of play that out. Yeah, but like there's no way for me to come up with one rule to give you to do all that. And ancient thinkers don't try to in the same way. And Buddhism as a philosophical and intellectual tradition has a whole lot to say about that, and a whole lot to say about the conditioned and mutually dependent nature of ideas and the mind, meaning that ideas and concepts and forms always emerge based on their relation to other concepts and are always shifting because those concepts are shifting. They're not fixed, right? And while in analytic philosophy, such theories came up after like pragmaticism, not pragmatism, pragmaticism by Charles Peirce or Pierce. I'm never sure how to pronounce his name. I've heard different things. That those ideas kind of have come up elsewhere in the history of Western thought, but they come a lot later. All right. Yeah, my pastor talks about hermeneutics constantly. I do think some religious thinkers, people who go to church, actually do have to think about hermeneutics of reading because you have to have a hermeneutic of understanding the Bible because it's an ancient text. All right. Oh, my hatred for John Dewey. That's going to be a whole chapter in the Lash book because Lash also hates John Dewey, and Lash and I don't agree on everything. Okay, guys, I'm not a Christopher Lashian in that I just think that everything Christopher Lash wrote in his 10 or so books is absolutely correct. There's a lot of it, particularly if you're on the Patreon, you'll hear me like talk about stuff I really disagree with Lash on, but we both hate John Dewey. And the reason why we hate John Dewey is that his pragmatist logic, which he sees as like standing up against capital, actually ends up reinforcing it at almost every turn. There's a reason why Deweyan education is a popular education paradigm, even in like charter school reformism, right? Can we just believe in science? No. If you don't know what's like, that's like saying, can't we just believe in God? You don't know what God is? You can't define it? What do you believe in? Trust the science means what exactly? This is not to say that I think we should just like be muddle-headed postmodernists who don't believe in science. The thing is, like, a lot of times when I talk about belief in science, people are actually believing, quote, science is literally a decade, 4 decades, 5 decades out of date. They don't know the most recent research that complicates the paradigm. Or they'll talk about like species and stuff without realizing that that concept isn't even that stable in science itself. And if you know the philosophical debates in science, you actually have to keep up with relatively new outlier paradigms in science itself, which complicate the whole thing. So no. That said, I worry about going too much into the demarcation problems and whatnot for this reason, because they've also been picked up by people who use it to peddle patent bullshit. Because if you don't know what you're looking at really well, it can make it seem like science has no foundation at all. Okay. One thing that might help more is book lists that cover. I do a lot of book lists, guys. Like there's tons. For solo vlogs, you do cite stuff, but for interviews, you don't. Yeah, I don't cite for interviews because I don't know what's going to come up. If we are talking about an author's specific book, or if I limit it to one text, I will always cite that in an interview, or at least tell you where to find it. The problem is, I could go back and add it back in, but I don't have the time. I just don't. I wish I did. So if people who are knowledgeable do that for me and send it to me, I will always publish it for free and give you credit for doing it. Is part to the left still going on? The answer to that is maybe no. That is subcontracted on an individual basis by Doug Lane. I don't have any control over that. We are not. I don't work for Sublation Magazine in any way or form. I'm not affiliated beyond individual episodes of which I am paid a very small amount of money. Not a super small. I mean, it's not nothing, but to do. That depends on a bunch of factors. Doug's mood, whether or not we denounced each other in the past week. I can tell you right now, we have politically been pretty far apart lately, but we are not at personal odds at all. So you just make of that what you will. So if Doug wants them, they'll happen, I guess. If they don't, they won't. Lately, he seems to be concerned about different things. I'm surprised I've never heard you mention William Blake. Do you have an interest in him? Yes. I wrote I wrote like 3 undergraduate papers on William Blake. What do you want to know? It's just, it's a kind of materialist Gnosticism of late Romanticism. I just don't go into English Romanticism that much on the show because it's not particularly relevant. China has a definite history of the West Nile Jackson. Absolutely. Yeah. Caliphate, Ottomans, etc. Yeah, I don't use caliphate because I use Islamicate and not caliphate because there's different caliphates that you could be referring to and still be referring to the Islamicate word. And so if I'm going to refer to a caliphate, I usually refer to the specific one, like the Ottoman or the Ubayyid or the Fatimid, etc. I'm not going to be referring to, or the Abbasid, excuse me. I'm not going to be referring to like the caliphates in general. Do, do, do. When I studied Buddhism in school, I always had the hardest time squaring the prescriptive nature of the precepts with the anti-insters. Well, the thing is, the prescriptive nature of the precepts are actually vows that you undertake for training. The precepts are not universal morality. The paramitas are universal morality, and they're not usually taught. The precepts are training vows. Training vows and rules are prescripted, and Buddhist morality, in that sense, is vow-based. It's based off of what you vow to do. So yeah. What do you think when Zizek says on Buddhism versus Christianity and Buddhism being buried with capital so people we've been servile? I think Zizek doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about on the history of Buddhism. As far as I can tell, he's never read a Buddhist text. He's only listened to Silicon Valley people who like get off on meditating and extrapolated from that, ignoring that there's also plenty of Silicon Valley people who are fucking reactionary Catholics. So I don't know, makes of that what you will. Lots of commentary on believing science. Could I talk more about the Mount Davis panel? Sure. It was a panel of scholars. This was an intellectual history scholars. These are not Marxist, I don't think. These are like on a spectrum of different kinds of liberals. It was led by Andrew Hartman, who is a Marxist. He's been on the show before. He's writing a book on Marx in America. It should come out in about 2 years. He'll be back on the show. In fact, he didn't get to give his speech much on Old God's New Enigmas, and I'm thinking about approaching him and asking him to come on the show to do what he was going to do at that plenary for Old God's New Enigmas. But Lichtenstein talked about the kind of quasi third worldism in Mike Davis in the 80s and the early 90s as a rejoinder to the popular, post New Left love of English workerism from E.P. Thompson that was very popular in the New Left, that was very voluntaristic about what the working class could achieve and what working class could do, and Mike Davis got very into on his own into the registration school of French Marxism. I mean, not registration, regulation school of French Marxism, and incorporated that pretty early on as an answer to the problems of Marxist humanism that wasn't Althusserian. So he went in a different direction. But that you kind of have to read Mike Davis's notes to know that, and to see what he's doing with that. There was also discussions about late Victorian Holocaust and how important that was. That was done by a scholar who believe it mostly concerned with Latour. I'm going to look up her name really fast. And then there were discussions on Buddha's Wagon and In Praise of Barbarians about Davis's politics at the end of the Bush administration, and how he did not actually really well predict what was going to happen with Obama and the complications of like Libya, etc. The scholars at hand were Nelson Lichtenstein, who spoke on Prisoners of the American Dream and City of Courts, Melanie McAllister, who spoke on late Victorian Holocaust, and Salib Yaqub, who stood on Buddha's Wrath and Praise of Barbarians. I don't think these papers are public, so I don't want to go too much more into them. but I thought it was enlightening. And unfortunately, it was not recorded, so I can't tell you where to go look it up. But read as much Mike Davis as you can. I don't always agree with Mike Davis, but I do think it's important. All right. Some positive feedback. I really enjoyed your Mark Fisher videos because the readings are short and focused, which allows me, a slow reader, to keep up. Well, I'm going to do more of those kinds of things. There's just a lot of short essays coming up. Speaking of the history of science, have you read anything on the history of Paracelsus, such as a fascinating figure during a true? Oh no, I have not. See, the best book on Paracelsus. That's a good one. I am obsessed with that period of time. Um, so I I've been mostly. I got obsessed with that actually uh, through a podcast. But a really rigorous one called The Secret History of Western Esotericism, which you would think is like an occult woo podcast. It's not. It's about the history of physics and philosophy, and they've done a lot of stuff on Paracelsus. Good old Swiss Paracelsus. But a book, I've read books on the time period and on alchemy, but I can't think of one just on Paracelsus by himself. Maybe the Walter Pagel book from 1982. That might be a good one. That's the only ones coming to mind off of a quick look up. Okay, another question. Good interview or solo topic idea. Why conspiracy theories and pseudoscience really seem so popular now, and how much that has to do with democratization of media? Believe it or not, I have something that I think I was talking to a scholar about this in 17th century America on the similar topic. And so we might be talking about how this has happened before in extrapolating this. This is a young scholar who I believe, I'm not going to drop their name yet because their research is not published. And I want to have them on the show, but this is a young scholar who I believe works at Washington University. So yeah, definitely. I definitely have that in the mind. Blah blah blah. Phytamids. People saying goodbye. Any good research on understanding the real estate market? I'm trying to get a grasp of that myself. If I find it, I'll do a show on it, Andrew. Do you even care what the Joker has to say at this point? Which Joker? I don't know who you're talking about. Probably not asking me a question. Sometimes these questions are aimed at me and I can't tell. So, oh, you mean Zizek? Zizek bad. There's a good book by Purser by The Misuse of Mindfulness, but I don't think you can extrapolate from Purser to all of Buddhism. I think Purser's a Buddhist even. Oh yeah, Daniel and I still talk. So, are you familiar with Wilhelm Schmidt? I am not. This is the first thing I've ever heard that I don't know anything about. But yeah, I'm still talking to Todd. Don't worry about that. Okay, good question. What can you say about the obfuscation of labor exploitation and how that relates to the broader culture when job creators are good, salesmanship is desirable, and financial? Here's the thing. Like, people have been talking about this problem directly, like these three things, for 40 years, right? So what's a good book on the distortions of that relationship? Believe it or not, I would actually look up the earlier work of Nelson Lichtenstein just because he's on my mind. But he wrote about shifts in labor relationships pretty early on. And then Mike Davis himself, Prisoners of the American Dream, is a great book about that. People like Daniel Tutt. Do you find Thomas Ferguson to be useful at all? I just have not read or listened to enough to know, but I'll add that to my list of stuff to explore. To a video on the Inner Mongolia incident. Why not? Whatever legalities by Adorno is the message in the bottle on the New Left review. It's super short. Yeah, I can do that. Whatever realities. Okay. And something about Thomas Ferguson's dissertation. All right. I hope you guys enjoyed this rare public Q&A. I don't know. I didn't get mad at any of you and yell at any of you, so I'm just gonna get mad at Nicola now. Nicola, screw off. All right, good, done it. Everyone can say I did it. Um, um, I really enjoyed this today. I hope you guys continue to like and subscribe. Um, you just the first name I saw, Nicola. It's okay. Um, please share this stuff. I'm not on Twitter, and I'm not going back on Twitter. I get anxiety when I'm on Twitter. Like, I don't get anxiety from any other form of social media, but Twitter makes my blood pressure go up. I know. I wear a Fitbit, and there was a day that I was on Twitter that my heart rate was above like 120 for 4 hours. So yeah. Oh yeah, Strom, screw off. I forgot you too. There you go. But anyway, yeah. Take care. Take care of yourself. It's I know this is I'm beginning to think I need to like sign off with this more often, but you have a moral obligation to take care of yourself and cultivate yourself. You know, people can call that self-care. I call it self-discipline, but they're both related. Do that for yourself. Don't get sucked into Twitter spirals all the time. Don't just fret over the anxiety of the impending doom future, because you can't do anything about the impending doom future by yourself anyway, but you can take care of yourself. So do that. Protect your peace. It's really important. If you're going to be there for the hard shit that's coming at you, that when you're not actively dealing with that you are doing something good. And by good, I do not necessarily mean playing video games for 40 hours a day, but, you know, just chill. All right. Take care of my peeps.